All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center, and we're joined today by Professor Karla FC Holloway. And let me get all of this out. Okay. Who is the James B. Duke Professor of English at Duke University, where she holds appointments in the law school, women's studies, and African American studies. Right. Okay. So let's start there. Just thinking about all of your titles and all of your appointments. When you started this career, this journey
many years ago,
was there even an ability to think of yourself as interdisciplinary as you've become? I mean, just the law school piece is fascinating in thinking about your career.
Well, that's the gray hair. But it's interesting that I always thought that Duke adapted itself to me rather than I adapted myself to Duke. But since the beginning of my career, I've been an interdisciplinary scholar. I remember being first hired, and they called me a generalist because I could, teach a Victorian and the linguistics. And what I found out later, it was really interdisciplinary-ness that I was doing. So when I came to Duke, my appointment was actually in the English department, and everyone assumed I was in African and African American studies. And then it became a natural fit for me to be there as well. Right. And when I say the institution adapted itself to me, there's a part of me that means that quite seriously, that the ways in which, when I was an administrator, we thought about faculty appointments being more invigorated than stable in the department, because frankly, that was who we were getting as applicants. That was the new generation of scholars coming in, and they knew what the language was. And so the institution, I think, adapted itself to the academy because we naturally leaked. We were not, I used to talk to faculty about, well, you might be in the Department of Psychology, which was one department before it was two, and now it's three or something. But at Duke, we really support your moving, and some people I had to talk into that, and some people didn't come to Duke because of that. But mostly I think people are here because they like the fact that Duke leaks.
Something you just said, that the institution had to adapt to you. When you think about African American studies, women's studies, constructs that are naturally interdisciplinary, right? No one had to tell those units in the late 1960s that you had to be interdisciplinary, because that's the only way folks could roll. Why do you think it's taken so long for these institutions, and still haven't really, to recognize, as they're trying to remake it over and over again and rebrand these institutions, remake the wheel, why don't they go back to African American studies and women's studies as kind of the blueprint for how to do that effectively?
If we just want to talk about my frustrations, we could start right there. Not only the blueprint for structurally and institutionally what should happen, but the blueprint for the kind of scholarship and the kind of scholars that would help them understand what's happening better in the institution today. So the expertise in those departments that understand the way gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and difference work in our society would help the institution understand the way those things work in institutional cultures. So I think it's still the issue of institutional legitimacy, certainly not stability, because we worked very hard to understand how do you become a stable unit? You become more like a department. And I really had to do some fighting there to sort of say, no, we are not the center where students gather and find their safe spaces. We're the academic unit. And even some pushback from students there.
Because there's a price to be paid there. I mean, for those units who've made the decision that this is an intellectual enterprise, an academic, women's studies, at least here at Duke, has done this, because you see it at other institutions, women's studies and the women's center.
It was a battle here.
Kind of get morphed together, and students are very critical, kind of older guard, black administrators and folks are kind of a little upset because, there's a feeling that black faculty aren't there for students in the way that these kinds of entities had to be there for students in the late 1960s and 1970s, because there wasn't anybody else here.
And my argument, of course, is that the institution better adapt itself to our presence.
Right.
So rather than seeing special spaces for us to congregate, you'd better make the institution hospitable
to everyone.
To everyone.
Yeah.
And that's harder work, and that goes back, to, I think, to your question about why is it more difficult? Because it's still easy institutionally to think, let's just do a weekend for them, or let's just do a particular focus, rather than to think about the seamless integration of these issues that we study in these academic disciplines into the structures of the university.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center with Professor Karla FC Holloway, who's the James B. Duke Professor of English, holding appointments also in the Duke Law School, as well as African and African American Studies and Women's Studies. She's the author of several books, including 2011's Private Bodies, Public Texts, Race, Gender, and Cultural Bioethics, Bookmarks, Readings in Black and White, a memoir that was Rutgers University Press 2006, and Passed On, African American Mourning Stories, which is now in its third printing.
It is.
And just published Legal Fictions, Constituting Race, Composing Literature, 2014, Duke University Press. Talk about the new book.
The new book is the book where I think I figured it out, and so it's time to stop. Or at least I've figured it out. And it's a conundrum in some sense for me, because I kept going towards this idea of, now I understand why we're still. It came from the, why are we all post-racial yet?
Right,
and certainly we know we're not. And every structure in American law and in American politics and in American culture suggests we ought to be moving in that direction, but we're not. So I was trying to figure out why not. And the puzzlement for me is that I think we're not, because the law keeps us as identifiably different populations. And thank goodness it does, because we need the protections of law in this society to make sure that rights are protected, and that I understand, or that someone understands, that when a policeman stops just black people after black people after black person, then there's a pattern of racial disparity there that the law has to attend to. But I think it's both the construction of race into law, as well as the social response to race being something that the law can protect and notice, that has kept us from being post-racial. Do I think that this is a particularly problematic thesis? I do, because I know exactly what can be done with it in the wrong hands. But the facts of American life and American socialities point to the reality that if we did not have legal protections, we'd be in a mess more trouble than we are today.
And part of the argument that you make through the book is the way that various fictions, have addressed these issues. Tried to parse, concerns around black identity, how the law represents, black identity. Obviously, our president, has become kind of a
I'm going to let you say it.
Centerpiece of these conversations. I mean, I was struck, early in the introduction, you raised this question about, is he a black president or is he just another white one? And that's both in considering, his, biological makeup, as it might even be a question of his policy.
And people have argued exactly that. I'd like to think of him as, oh, he's just another president, exercising presidential authorities the way presidents do, but our anticipation for what he might do puts him into those racialized categories.
Quite honestly, if we compare him to the 43 who came before him, and our expectations were aligned along those lines.
Aligned political and constitutional lines.
There wouldn't be any surprise about how he has governed.
Right. And my own Twitter account reflects my sort of peek at those who I think you've been on the receiving end of that peak of those who want him to behave differently.
Yeah.
I want him to exercise his constitutional authority in all the ways he can. And it's law school that pushed me to that side, frankly. The literary part of me, the cultural studies part of me gets it exactly. The 2 years in law school taught me that it's about constitutional powers.
And that was something that struck me, in some of your commentary around Ferguson and how the president responded to Ferguson and what he said and what he couldn't say. And you kept reminding folks that, part of what he's not saying is really connected to his wanting to protect the integrity
of that process.
Right. And talk a little bit, because I think folks miss that kind of dynamic. Because, we almost intuitively know that presidents don't, particularly in the context of states' rights and all these, they really can't do anything.
Not a thing.
Right? But we still expect them to have a kind of bully pulpit, something symbolic that will make us feel better.
Right. Well, notice when he did speak on the domestic violence issues that have, or I like the way you phrased it, as intimate partner violence issues that have come out in the NFL past that moment. And those are not sutured to any particular kind of state authority.
Right.
But the action, but what has happened in Ferguson is still procedurally going on in the grand jury. All one side needs is for the president to speak, to turn the table, so to speak, and say that the president is weighed in, this is a tainted process, and we know, or worse, the executive branch is weighed in. So he did exactly the right thing by sending in the judicial branch for the oversight there. But you reminded me to look more carefully at the text of what he did say. And I thought it was not only tepid, but I did think it was offensive in terms of blaming the victim. And I've said more than once, my job in some retirement year could be a speechwriter if he still needs one, because there was language he could have used that would have been, that would have both protected his responsibility and acknowledged
and show some humanity.
Exactly. Well, you have a choice in a situation like that of which bodies to focus on. And you could focus on the bodies who have been traumatized by the illegalities in Ferguson for centuries, I would argue. But instead of doing that, he focused on a few folks who might have been acting outside of even the majority of those who were protesting, not rioting.
Right. It's interesting because, part of my criticism of the president in terms of the language that he uses to talk about blackness, and often it's tethered to
and where he uses it.
And where he, is that his use of certain language really allows for other folks to have almost a comfort.
Yeah.
And so when the New York Times then follows up with a piece,
the He's No Angel piece.
Right. And I would argue that President Obama's own discourse allowed.
Oh, I think you're exactly right
for
there.
the New York Times to be comfortable and not expect even any pushback.
That's a bully pulpit that you're talking about. And we get our message from the person who's in the pulpit, and our tone and our language. I am both sorry and surprised to see him not be wiser and more judicious in the use of that tone, more compassionate and more thoughtful, because he doesn't have any point to make other than to lift us all up. But instead he is continuing the punitive, the preacher's punitive message to the congregation.
I've often felt that when the president talks about African Americans in particular, because his language is very different when he's addressing
he sort of slips
Africans,
into what he presumes is a more vernacular.
But when he talks to African Americans, his tone is often like, what African Americans have felt the tone has been from African immigrants. Right. Trying to figure out, the lay of the land with African Americans and why they are in the position that they are.
It seems to be consistently analytical, as if he's trying to figure this thing out, when he has plenty of folk in his own family, in his community, in his own intellectual and scholarly communities as he was growing up, who would have schooled him differently. So there, I think the use of that, the consistent use of that tone throughout the presidency, at this point, we're in the second term, he no longer needs to
Right.
win re-election. So this would be a marvelous opportunity for him to relax into the truth. I'm not quite convinced that he's not adopted a pattern which is so familiar to him now, the bully pulpit and
That he can't
that
break.
he can't do
He can't
that.
break from it.
That's the only way I can think. So I think this is a remarkably intelligent and astute president. So I'm trying, and I trust his judgment because I'm sure he's dealing with things I will never know the background of.
Right.
And so my vote was for that judgment. But I think it's judgment in terms of how to speak to people who think that they have a relationship with him is still a bit skewed.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined here today by Professor Karla FC Holloway, James B. Duke Professor of English, holding appointments also in African American Studies at law school and Women's Studies here at Duke University. Right after Ferguson, suddenly the NFL takes over the frame.
Yeah.
In what might be described in several incidences of what we might just call, intimate black violence. I want to resist the term black on black crime.
Yeah.
But when we think about Ray Rice and intimate partner violence, and now when we have these conversations about Adrian Peterson, and how do you parent, and again, this kind of violence that takes place within black communities, it gets a little difficult because on the one hand, you want to weigh in on right. There's only one right side to weigh in when we talk about domestic violence, right? The same thing when we talk about violence against children. But the way that black bodies now become the symbolic space in which the nation talks about these dynamics, as if black bodies
and the
exist
perpetrators
in these
themselves are talking about it.
And as if these black bodies themselves exist in a vacuum of violence.
Right.
Becomes very difficult. And there's almost no space to talk about the broader historical context.
Yeah, and I think that historical space is important to both acknowledge and to escape from. This is a space where a lot of enslaved Americans, ran from.
Right.
So we could also, both domestically and intellectually and personally, run from the spaces that continue to trap us in modes of thinking of ourselves as being intimate with violence. When I wrote Private Bodies, one of the struggles I had in that book was to say, black people deserve their privacy, not to be splayed out in the street for 4.5 hours. But at the same time, bad acts happen in private spaces.
Yeah.
So weighing those things leaves me more with what happens if you really have a freed or a fugitive imagination that allows you to think of yourself as not tethered to the history, certainly beholden to it in one way, but not linked to a history that means we have to be so frightened of our children's potential that you'll be more scared of me than you are of your teacher or the person in the street, which is where I imagine a lot of the sociologists and psychologists who talk about how black parents discipline their children. There is a fear in raising a son. But that fear need not be attached anymore to harming that child.
Right. I mean, because there's a way, and I'm old enough to at least been raised at kind of the last moments of at least a legally segregated America, and at least the last remnants of it. And it's like the idea that you either act right, you have to act right or public, or you could be killed. And you have to know those lines, and those lines have to be drawn in the home,
right,
in the way that we discipline you.
And it's interesting you say that you were on the edges of that, and yet we see all of these eruptions happening today that prove we might not have been back. This might not be so back in the day as we thought. That the danger of being publicly black is still a danger that our bodies that we embody in just our presence and being. What I want to argue, though, that our response to that need not be the responses of fear we had anymore, that we can have a more empowered, personally empowered response to that in a way that at least doesn't endanger the children. You know, I've been tweeting about there's we used to put our children on the front lines.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote a very
60s.
moving piece about that in the aftermath of Ferguson. I mean,
just worried about it.
Yeah.
Just worried about the ways in which a 4 or 5-year-old processes hands up, don't shoot. Well, they're not processing anything.
Yeah.
You know, they're processing something that we might not be sure of that we will see 10 years later. And I think that we have earned the right to be careful and protective of our children. And that's a right that I think sometimes puts us at odds with public blackness. It is an interesting space because I see myself slipping into, and my evidence for that comes from fiction, but at the same time, the place of that is a legal place. You know, what's happening now in some of these cases of, and I like now domestic violence. We are talking about violence in the home, not just towards partners, but
right.
towards children,
Right.
will be adjudicated in spaces, in legal places. So we have to figure out how we're going to operate there. It's not kept behind those closed doors.
Yeah.
It's in social media now. So we have to understand where that negotiation now happens. I think at one point it may be, and I'm just thinking this through as I'm talking to you, it may be that we felt that we were more protected in our homes if we could just close the door
Right.
and get it right.
Right. We've been joined today by Professor Karla FC Holloway, who's a James B. Duke Professor of English at Duke University. She also holds appointments in the Duke Law School, Women's Studies, and African American Studies here at Duke University. She is the author of several books, including the brand new Legal Fictions, Constituting Race, Composing Literature. That would be Duke University Press.
It would be. I have loved working with Duke Press and really enjoyed writing that book, which I do think is my last work of nonfiction.
Of nonfiction.
You know, I'm just going to slip on over into my imaginary world now. But this was a book that I was realizing what was happening in our literature was, at one point in literary criticism, we were saying it's not the social. You need not solve the problems of our public spaces in literature. But I do think literature has taken up this question of our representation in law, from Native Son's infamous trial to Toni Morrison's argument about where a black veteran might find not only a safe space, but one that protects the freedoms he has been fighting for. So I think literature gets it and troubles those spaces, and I like being in those fictive spaces, and you might find me there next.
I love this dedication to your husband.
Oh, you get it.
No, it's the last leaf.
Yeah.
And while we're here, you know, we record Left of Black here at the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke University, and you were here when this space was dedicated. You know, Bill Cosby was here.
Oh, yes. Jesse Jackson was here.
Talk a little bit, you know, it's been 5 years, you know, since Dr. Franklin's death. Talk about what his legacy still means. I mean, we were joking off camera. You know, many students come to Duke and have no sense
of who he
is, right? Not even who he was, who he is. You know, what did he mean to you? You know, both as a kind of scholar, but also being here with him. Well,
very personally, I have told the story before, I think, of how I remember one of the books on my parents' bookshelves, From Slavery to Freedom. And that was when it was an older edition.
It was
a thick book. And the other thick book was the Bible. So I'm seeing the Bible, thick book, when do I want to read that? And From Slavery to Freedom. And then when I went to Duke University, and my father said, oh, John Hope Franklin's school. And so that made it all okay.
Right.
And the best part of my being at Duke was that my father had passed. I think my mother came down when the center was opening. That's when we had a program with Toni Morrison and John Hope Franklin. And she came down and met both of them. And they were both so gracious to her. And my memory of John Hope is, he was a very old school gentleman. And of course fit my mother's idea of who he should be exactly. And his being so gracious to my mother and his legitimizing my academic space by inhabiting it, so my father recognized where I was. And so in that personal way, he made a space for me. He was a dear friend. I loved him deeply. I loved the way he visited his wife, Aurelia, every day in the nursing, even when she had to be taken to the nursing home. I loved what he represented for America. I loved seeing his flashes of anger around certain events, which he felt comfortable enough to share with me. But his public persona was always the John Hope Franklin angry. Even President Clinton had this strange phrase at his funeral. He was an angry, loving man, or an angry good man. I said, who the heck is he talking about? But I think President Clinton saw his anger because, of course, he headed the Race Commission during the time the Monica Lewinsky events were coming out, and it attenuated some of the work that the Race Commission was doing. So he probably did see some of John Hope Franklin's anger. But people held him in great esteem, and I hold him today in great esteem. So having this space at Duke and working to, frankly, help Duke recognize what a treasure he was that needed to be institutionalized. A lot of my work, I think, has been about institution building. And one of the things I wanted to make sure of was that we institutionalized John Hope Franklin because he did that for Duke.
Well, we at Left the Black hold Karla FC Holloway in high esteem. We want to thank you for joining us here.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. You know that, Mark.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black light Troy